We are joined now by Harvard Law professor and criminal defense attorney Alan Dershowitz. And Alan is also, of course, the author of the ebook Terror Tunnels, the case for Israel's just war against Hamas. Alan is also a blogger for Newsmax and joins us regularly, a friend of the program. Alan, great to talk to you.
Thank you very much.
All right, so, we heard the president last night. Obviously, the American public, the people in Ferguson did not listen to him. But when you see people crying in the streets, saying that they have been wronged, even though they're not directly related to this case, what does it say to you about how far the grand jury process in this case was, I guess, perverted? That the people did not believe that the grand jury was going to be able to find a just result here?
Well, there are three separate issues. One is there a general problem of police shooting unarmed black young men too often? The answer to that is clearly yes, and that's what I think the riots in the street were mostly about. Second, was the grand jury correct in not indicting him on the first shooting? The first shooting is when Brown was very close to the car and the bullet wounds proved that he was literally on top of the officer. That was clearly the right decision. The second decision is really a much closer one. When he was away from the car, did he have his hands up? Was he charging? That was a closer question. But I think the grand jury came to the right decision because generally you don't indict somebody unless you believe you can convict him at a jury trial. And any reasonable prosecutor would come to the conclusion that even if he were indicted, he would have been acquitted by a jury because there was reasonable doubt written all over this case. Now, some of the TV commentators, particularly on CNN, just got it wrong. They were acting as if the probable cause required in a case like this is like the probable cause required to stop somebody or search somebody or even arrest somebody. That's just not the way it works. You need much more than that. You need to have a conviction that, based on the evidence, if it were to be believed, a jury would probably convict. And that kind of probable cause was lacking in this case. And I have to tell you, I think the media did a terrible job last night of whooping up a frenzy by misinforming the public about how indictments generally work. You had people on CNN saying, well, I'm a former prosecutor. Right. I know I would have indicted in this case. That's just nonsense. That's not the way indictments work.
Well, Alan, let's take a look at
the seek indictments unless they're pretty convinced they can get a conviction.
Let's take a look at the district attorney in this case, Robert McCulloch. And there's been some criticism as to whether the DAs who work so closely with police are the right people to head up these types of investigations, specifically in a situation like this. What do you think about McCulloch's job here handling this grand jury deliberations, and whether or not district attorneys are really the right people to lead these types of investigations?
Well, usually the problem is the opposite. District attorneys are not the right people to lead these kinds of things because they almost always err on the side of over-prosecuting, of convicting people when they shouldn't be prosecuted. District attorneys clearly have a stake in the outcome. So, if you wanted to reform the system, you'd have neutral people presenting it, not prosecutors. But this is a unique case because they're saying the prosecutor was too lenient to the defendants. First time I've heard that, practicing law 50 years, that a prosecutor was too lenient to the defendant.
All right, and Alan, I want to also ask you real quickly, because we're going to leave the Ferguson issue aside, because I also want to talk to you about the Iran nuclear negotiations when we come back from a commercial break. But one more question for you real quick before we part. We know Officer Darren Wilson will not face these criminal charges here, but there are still pending investigations. What does he face now civilly and perhaps this federal civil rights case?
There will be no federal civil rights action against him. The same criteria that apply in state court apply even more rigorously in criminal prosecutions by civil rights division, so they won't indict him. But there will be a civil suit. And it's a close question because on a civil suit, you need just a preponderance of the evidence. My prediction, if there were a civil suit, he probably would not be held liable. The evidence is just too uncertain here.
All right, well, time will tell on that. We'll continue to talk about Ferguson, what took place last night, and what's going to happen today throughout the day, through continuing the show. But we're going to be back with Alan Dershowitz right after this commercial break, talk about these failed nuclear negotiations with Iran. We'll be right back after this. We continue our conversation now, and we're pleased to be rejoined again by Alan Dershowitz, of course, a huge defender of Israel, former Harvard Law professor and author. And Alan, we hear Kerry say this. It seems to many folks like this is just deja vu all over again, yet another delay in these talks. What is the point at this point?
Well, I think he's making a serious mistake. I think that the doubts have not been resolved. I think the United States and Europe are now simply seeking a delay in the time that it would take Iran to develop nuclear weapons. They are creating a threshold nuclear state as part of this deal. And it's not clear to me that Israel can accept a threshold nuclear state sworn to its destruction. Rafsanjani, the former president, once said that if we develop nuclear weapons and bomb Tel Aviv, we'll kill 3 million Jews. They'll retaliate and bomb Tehran, kill 10 million Muslims, and the trade-off would be worth it. When you have a suicide nation that sent close to 100,000 of its own children to certain death, giving them plastic tokens, telling them they're going to paradise, you can't trust them with not only with a nuclear weapon, but with threshold ability to create a nuclear weapon secretly in a short period of time. So I'm not optimistic as to how these talks will end up.
And what do you expect Israel to do between now and June when they begin or are set to resume these talks?
Well, I think they're thinking about ending them in June, not resuming them in June, but there'll be a lot of pressure. Israel will talk to its allies and its partners. Remember, Congress has an important role to play here. The Constitution divides foreign policy authority between Congress and the president. This is more like a treaty than it is like a deal. A treaty requires 2/3 support of the Senate. I think that the president ought to be involving, and the Secretary of State ought to be involving congressional leaders and Congress in these ongoing negotiations to make sure that if there's a deal, it's a deal that not only the president accepts because he may be leaving office relatively soon, but that the American people, through their elected representative, accept. And I don't think the deal as it's now proposed is something the American people accept or Congress would accept.
Now, we've talked about this issue a number of times. I mentioned deja vu all over again. You have repeatedly talked about the missteps and the mistakes that John Kerry has made. What is your level of confidence in Kerry as he continues to sit down and continue these talks?
Well, I like John Kerry. I know him for a long time. The woman who's doing the actual negotiations has a very mixed reputation. What I worry about is a repeat of Korea, a repeat of Pakistan, where we gradually allow an enemy, essentially, to develop nuclear weapons over time. The big issue is not whether they're 6 months or a year away, it's whether they can make that transition secretly without American eyes seeing what they're doing. And the transition, once you have the centrifuges and the product, the transition from civil to military can be done very quietly. It doesn't need big manufacturing facilities to do it. It can be done very quietly underground. So the great fear is that Iran, under this procedure, will eventually develop nuclear weapons, and that has to stop. The President of the United States and Secretary Kerry have to announce unequivocally that it's American policy that Iran will never, ever have nuclear weapons, and that the United States will do whatever it takes, including military action if necessary, to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons power. That statement must be made, or else this administration will go down in history along with Neville Chamberlain as having failed to prevent the greatest evil of the 21st century in the way that Chamberlain failed to prevent the greatest evil of the 20th century.
Well, Alan, somebody who has made a statement or a similar statement is Senator Ted Cruz, your former student there at Harvard Law School. A couple of nights ago, you were at a speech with Ted Cruz, who was the featured guest there, and he is being talked about as one of the most ardent supporters, maybe the most aggressive supporter of Israel. Tell us about the event with about 30 seconds left to go, and do you feel that Ted Cruz might be the best man to defend Israel here if he were to become the next president of the United States?
Well, I'm not going to comment about his political future. I purposely went to this event to show unity and solidarity. I disagree with Ted on a great many domestic issues. I tend to agree with him largely about Israel, and I wanted to show my support for his courage in standing up for Israel. We can continue to disagree on a range of other issues, but we can show mutual support for Israel, whether it comes to the right, the left, the center, Christians, or Jews. I think Israel must remain a bipartisan issue, and that's why I was at that event.
Well, and we thank you very much for being with us here today. And if you want to learn more about what's taking place in Israel right now, you should read Alan's book, Terror Tunnels, The Case for Israel's Just War Against Hamas. Alan Dershowitz, always great to talk to you, sir.
Thank you so much.
America's Forum continues after this short commercial break.